Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We are pleased to, this is the first episode in the 2023 season of the Brewcast. And with that, we are pleased to have the return of a Krulak Center alum who will be helping us through this very timely conversation on cyber warfare in the war in Ukraine. About a month into the war, we hosted a panel on how the cyber conflict in Ukraine had unfolded, sort of what we knew at that point, both in things expected and unexpected. And now with the war approaching its 1 year mark, we have Dr. Brandon Valeriano and Mr. Gavin Wilde to walk us through what we've seen in the interim now, what we've seen and what we've not seen in the conflict of or in the conduct of cyber warfare during this conflict. So Dr. Brandon Valeriano, he's one of our distinguished fellows here at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare. He was the one who chaired that last panel on cyber. He's been a long time supporter of the Brewcast. This partly exists because of his work, so it's great to have him on again. PhD from Vanderbilt University. He's also a senior advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0. Before his current positions, we had him here as one of the Donald Bren Chairs for Military Innovation at the Krulak Center. He's published 6 books and dozens of articles on cybersecurity and international security. And we're also grateful today to have Mr. Gavin Wilde here as our other guest. He is a senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he applies his expertise on Russia and information warfare to examine the strategic challenges posed by cyber and influence operations, propaganda, and emerging technologies. So, gentlemen, welcome to both of you. To Mr. Wilde, we're going to start off with you because part of the core of this conversation are a couple of papers that you had published under the Carnegie Endowment, specifically looking at this. So I'll turn it over to you first to kind of give us the highlights of those papers and what you and your co-authors saw.
Sure. Thanks again for having me. This set of papers really kind of started off last autumn as my team here under the Technology and International Affairs program kind of decided that enough time has probably passed to start really researching what the cyber aspect of this conflict has looked like and see if we could at least draw some inferences or insights. My part in that and the first paper that in that series that I contributed to really looks at what Russia's own expectations were going into this conflict, or what more broadly how they've conceptualized information warfare or cyber warfare in the lead up to February 24th, 2022. And so I really wanted to try and get inside their heads and look at what they've written over the past several decades now of theorizing about cyber and information conflict to see, what was their ideal for how this would turn out. And so that's the first paper, Russia's Unmet Expectations. We also kind of wanted to look at why clearly a lot of commentators in the West were kind of surprised at how Russia underperformed expectations. And so that was another aspect that I wanted to see if we could bridge the gap between what was broadly expected prior to February of last year and what turned out. And so I start off in the paper by kind of giving an intro into how Russia's view of the information environment is really a lot different than the Western or certainly the US view. And I would boil that down into one key aspect in that Russia views the information space as being kind of a space for perception to be shaped. And underneath that umbrella is really where the more technical, or what we would deem offensive cyber operations, really happen. And that's kind of in contrast to the US conception, which is really network centric. You have the so-called CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. That's really kind of how we think about cyber and cybersecurity, really technocentric, where the Russian view of information is a lot more psychosocial in its emphasis. And so opening with that and understanding that, then we can kind of look at some of the unmet expectations, both on the Western side as well as in Moscow. And that, for me, really boils down to three key points that I outline in the first paper. Number one is kind of this organizational or structural impediment. And by that, I mean, Russia really hasn't thought, or Russian thinking about incorporating cyber, an offensive cyber capability, into its military command or warfighting structures relative to the US or other Western powers is really pretty new. It's really in its youth. They really only started thinking about having to incorporate offensive cyber capability into their military command structure, from what I can tell from open sources and from Russia's own writing about this, sometime after the Russo-Georgian War of 2008. And I kind of include a timeline in the paper that walks through how they seem to have been conceptualizing this. And two things really stand out. One, that they really only kind of stood this up, this analog, if you will, this rough analog to a US cyber command, let's say, in 2015, 2016 timeframe. And at that time, based on what I can tell from open sources, is that a lot of the focus was on information assurance, or kind of protecting the MOD's own networks, and counter propaganda. Again, that really psychosocial element, but there was less stress or emphasis necessarily on offensive cyber operations. So that's one thing to consider. Number two is that most of the capacity to perform offensive, disruptive or destructive cyber attacks really rests within the GRU, the military intelligence organization there, and the FSB, which is putatively the domestic security service. Now, the issue with that is those two entities have a lot of kind of territoriality on cyber issues, longstanding. But with the MOD and the military command structures on top of that, there's a lot of organizational kind of competition and turf warring that goes back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and kind of how the KGB split up some of its issue buckets. And so there's not a lot of indication that the cyber capacity, the capacity to perform offensive cyber operations that exists within under the Russian state, it's not clear that it's very easily kind of unified and directed towards a military objective. That's not an easy task in the Russian system. And by a lot of accounts, the decision making around performing what I would call kind of the strategically impactful offensive cyber operations, the command structure for that, or the decision making around whether or not to do so, really rests at really high levels and is often a political decision rather than a military one. Now, there's certain echoes of that in our own system, where there's a lot of discussion around how much authority to delegate down, how far down into the command chain to delegate it. That, from what I can tell, seems to kind of still be at very high levels at the Security Council, the presidential administration, et cetera. And so all of that being said, I think the biggest hypothesis that I came away with is that the military does not have the ability to kind of draw upon Russian offensive cyber capacity easily. And where they do, it seems to have been focused primarily on kind of a counter-propaganda mission set, much less a technical or offensive cyber capacity. So the second hypothesis I kind of looked at was that the comparative resourcing of offensive cyber operations, again, relative to the intelligence services within the military, is simply much less. And so as you kind of look through that timeline, you can see how there's just a lot less familiarity with target. There's a lot less familiarity with exercising. And while I have certain issues with the framing of persistent engagement, as it's called, this really does demonstrate the value in some respects of time on target. It's simply not easy to port familiarity with targets from GRU or FSB and hand it over to a military command structure for actioning. And that poses lessons, I think, not only for how we think about the red team, but I think it also raises kind of issues that we need to re-examine how well we perform on the blue team side as well, how well integrated we are, and how that time on target and that familiarity really needs to be kind of ready and available for the kinds of military contingencies that I think Russia's dealing with right now. And then finally, in Russian information warfare thinking and doctrine, the quote unquote initial period of war is foundational. That's when you have to put all of your fires and concentrate so much of your focus. If you fail in that initial period, at least under Russian doctrine, you've really failed to achieve a lot of impacts. And you can see from the Viasat hacks and other wiper attacks in those first few weeks of the war that there was some attempt to adhere to this doctrine. But my sense is that the really close hold, secretive nature and poor planning of the initial incursion in February really did Russia no favors in kind of adhering to this doctrine. And again, really raises some issues about sequencing for blue team, where do you want to concentrate a lot of your cyber fires versus sequencing them out over time or holding them in reserve? I think those are all open-ended questions that are worth discussing more. And so in the interest of time, I'll kind of cap it there. I have a second paper where I really look at how Russia's approach to the information space writ large, from the technical to the psychosocial, is really rooted a lot more in domestic and regime stability concerns than kind of this expeditionary or expansionist view that I think we kind of reflexively or instinctively sometimes perceive, particularly with regard to propaganda and disinformation and influence campaigns. And so, again, that's where I would highlight that I think one of the biggest takeaways of looking at this conflict from my perspective is that Russia clearly has overemphasized and over-resourced the idea that information is kind of wieldable to shape and impact polities and populations in ways that clearly don't seem to have panned out well for them. And I think that should cause us to reassess our threat perceptions of Russia, but then ourselves kind of be introspective in how much weight we lend to the idea of information operations or offensive cyber operations writ large in being decisive in military conflict.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Wilde. Dr. Valeriano, good to see you. I'll turn it over to you for the second part of the discussion.
Great. Thank you. It's great to see Gavin present here, and I really like Gavin's work. And if you know me personally, you kind of know that a lot of us, including me in the field, have kind of developed a negative view of the progress of the cyber conflict field over time, because we're not exactly sure the work is pushing the boundaries. But I really like the highlight that he kind of focuses on in terms of the bureaucratic or the organizational processes of Russian activities. And it really goes to the central question here is having a capability doesn't exactly mean you can leverage that capability on the target. And that's something we've certainly known in the PME community in the United States for a long time on cyber, but it's really tough for people externally to get that message and to kind of disentangle this idea that there's a lot of threat intelligence on the work that the Russians have done over the years. The question, though, is can that be leveraged during the war in Ukraine? And that's a tough question to answer positively. So I love that stuff. I hope the field gets a bit better and starts to push the agenda of discovering new and interesting ideas and a hypothesis. But as we've seen the work on Ukraine and Russia develop over time, it's become largely regressive. And the other thing I want to say is I have a co-author here. My co-author is Grace Muller. She is a postdoc at West Point, but she is starting 2 new classes this week. So she gracefully begged out of this presentation and is forcing me to do it. I usually don't do presentations anymore, but I do want to highlight her work and influence here. I'm going to share my screen now. I have a few slides. I have a paper. I'm going to send it out for peer review and start to push it towards public opinion sources. probably within the next week. But we've had a little bit of delay with Christmas and everything else going on. But I'm just going to share some of the core findings here. So, I mean, first off, pundits and academics alike have come out with grand predictions about the war, starting with a shock and awe campaign or a cyber thunder run, as some people have noted. That is my favorite term, cyber thunder run, and that's actually the title of this paper. This comes from two NATO scholars writing in foreign affairs. My other favorite quote is from Jason Healy at Columbia. A Russian invasion of Ukraine may redefine how we think about cyber conflict because it will be the first time a state with real cyber capabilities is willing to take risks and put it all on the line. The question, though, is a lot of people have made grand predictions about how the war would go for the Russians and how the cyber course of the war would develop. And not a lot of people have examined the data that has become quite evident from this conflict. And our debate speaks to the core theories and assumptions about the future of war and the power of emergent technology. It also speaks to this idea of data in emerging wars, emerging conflicts, and with emergent tech. Here we scraped two sources, the Microsoft reports on the cyber war in Ukraine and the Ukrainian reports that they released up until May on the course of the cyber war in Ukraine. And we did this for two reasons. One, I wanted to do a different kind of sourcing than the typical data work that I've done with the DCID project that we've developed in coordination with the Army and the Navy. But also, I wanted to basically bias the study against myself and what my priors might be. If anyone has a motivation to over promote cyber conflict in Ukraine during this war, it is the Microsoft and the Ukrainians themselves. So that's where we get this data from. So I'll just blow through this data real quick. It's pretty simple. Past history, 2000, 2013, before the war in Ukraine, there were 3 cyber incidents between Ukraine and Russia. Then during the first phase of the war from 2014 to 2020, in the DCID data that's coming out in Cyber Defense Review any day now, there were 25 incidents between Russia and Ukraine, with an average severity of 3.24. We're using the severity scale from the DCID data. Okay, then 2022. There has indeed been an escalation in terms of intensity of the cyber conflict between the two sides, as measured by the number of incidents. There are 47 incidents in 2022 alone. That is significant. That is a high number. That is, of course, almost double the number of incidents during the first phase of the war. Although the sourcing is different, though, so you might suggest that that's to be expected. What isn't expected, though, is the severity. Now, what we did is we used the DCID severity coding, and the team of scholars working on this paper, 3 of us, we went through each incident, and we voted on the severity. And overall, we find that the severity of the 2022 conflicts is 2.45 out of 10, whereas 2014 to 2020, it's 3.24. And we know this is statistically significant, and this is a rather large decrease in terms of severity between the first phase of the war and the more active, bloody phase of the war in 2022. So that's the first finding. The other thing, of course, is severity over time. There is a clear pattern in past history between Russia and Ukraine. Particularly, you see an increase in severity between the two sides around 2015, 2016. This is when all the wipers and the attacks on critical infrastructure were occurring. Looking at 2022, it's a lot more messy. And it looks, I made this joke, I had some heart incidents recently. It looks like, the EKG monitor. There is no consistent pattern. It just goes up and down, up and down. There's no real, there's no real curve or way to fit a regression line. It just doesn't exist here. It'll be curious to see how this shapes out over the long term. Like, let's say this war goes to 2025, God forbid. Will this pattern start to shape in some sort of rational, expected way? I doubt it. But as we see here, there isn't a lot of evidence for a clear pattern of escalating severity during the war, either initially or over the course of the war. Operations by type. Okay, you would expect that of the three types, disruption is harassment, espionage, of course, is espionage or intelligence operations, and degrade operations seek to destroy or degrade or hamper the ability of the military to fight the war. Um, during 2020, you see a large propensity for espionage operations, and degrade is but 28% of overall operations. You would expect during the war in 2022 that degrade operations would increase. They actually do decrease, and we only see 21% of the operations being degrade operations. Espionage, of course, decreases because during the war, you need quicker, shorter operations to have an impact on the battlefield. And obviously, here, disruption increases dramatically. So if you want a kind of tagline as to what Russia's done to Ukraine during this war, they have extensively harassed Ukraine in the cyber dimension during the course of the war, but they have not sought to increase the severity and increase the types of operations that would normally be associated with a major war that this one is. And then almost finally, I believe, is targets. The majority of the targets from 2000 to 2020 are private and non-state. You would expect during a war that the majority of targets would shift towards government military targets. That did not happen. Basically, the pies are the same. So, and this may be a tagline for later, but I think one of the most interesting things about this conflict is that you don't really see a shift in operations for Russia. And the question is why? And I think one of the purposes of this work in the paper that I'm going to push out is to shift the debate away from, is there a cyber war, to really kind of accepting the fact that there really wasn't a cyber war. And the question is really why. And that's why I think Gavin's work is important. Other people's work is important, particularly Erica Longerin and, others operating in the field, because the question of why is often missed. The last slide here is on coordination of multi-domain operations. This was a big thing that was promoted in the Microsoft papers. And this goes to the heart of some of the debates we've been having in cyber conflict, particularly Eric Gartsky and Nadia Kostyuk and me and Jensen and Manes have kind of set up a question of, is cyber war complementary to ongoing military operations, or can they be substitutes? And this war and this conflict really goes to the heart of this idea of being complementary or coordinated, as the Microsoft people say. I don't like the term coordinated. I think it's better to code this as multi-domain operations. That's a bit simple and suggests that there are levels of coordination between the domains. And this is how we speak about this issue in the U.S. military. We find that only 7 of the 47 incidents involve multi-domain operations or coordination. Microsoft themselves lists 6 to 7. I don't know how many the total Microsoft really has. Well, I guess I kind of do because we kind of pulled that out, but I'm not really sure what their total final number is in their heads. But there isn't a lot of evidence of coordinated military cyber operations. And that goes to this other question of, if this is something we know and this is something we can accept, that's a whole other issue. The question is why? My co-author Grace really believes these are diversionary tactics. I would hope there's more research on this in the future. The example would be an attack around or near the nuclear power plants, or attack around or near the facilities of Ukraine to pump out its public media. And then you have the Russians just striking their antenna with a missile. That's an example of diversionary tactics. And that's something we need to start to investigate in cybersecurity. So to wrap it up, we find that while there's an increase in cyber operations, there is a cyber conflict. There is a dramatically intense cyber conflict. I accept that. That's not to be unaccepted. But we don't deserve an increase in concessions, severity, or even a difference in targets or methods of access. That's important because that demonstrates that while there is an increase in cyber conflict, you have to look at the content. That's like saying, you bought a lot of pizza. You got a lot of, you got a lot of Chuck E. Cheese pizza. That doesn't mean that pizza is any good. You can tell I'm hungry. I haven't eaten breakfast. But That's the point, really, is you need to look at the content of the operations, not so much the broad strokes and this idea, and I hear this quite often in the US military. We're under siege. There may be constant cyber conflicts. There may be constant cyber attacks, but you got to look at the content of these attacks because by and large, I think we're just eating crappy pizza in this field, and we need to think about more the significance of what's going on. We find little evidence for coordination in the form of multi-domain operations. And I think most importantly, and I'm going to wrap it up here, is that and this is kind of a theme I'm developing. And there's also a great piece by Stephanie Carvin in International Affairs. This idea that technology is not a shortcut for war. There's no fast, easy path towards victory using technology in war. I mean, maybe with nuclear weapons, but that would even be debated. And I think a lot of people's expectation that cyber will make war easier, quicker, faster, that it will sanitize war is grossly wrong and has polluted the discourse for too long. So I really hope we see better work. I really hope we see better questions into the future. But as to the question of cyber conflict in the Russia-Ukrainian war, yes, there is cyber conflict. Yes, there is a lot of attacks. But looking at the content of these attacks, the targets, and the efficacy of these attacks, you would have to come off wholly unsatisfied about the course of the war so far. We'll see what happens this year, but I do not expect much different to happen. So that's it for me. Kicking it back to Ian.
All right, great. Thank you, Dr. Valeriano. Okay, so to the audience, if you have any questions initially on the things that both of our guests discussed, just go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I'll start going through them as we get them. I do have a couple things to lead off with here, though, while we wait for those questions. Both of you sort of touched on this first question here, which is, things that, the pundits or the analysts didn't quite get right at the outset of the war. And Dr. Valeriano, before you came on, was talking with Gavin about, or I guess I mentioned it in the introduction, but I forget what I did 30 minutes ago. But about a month into the conflict, 9 months ago, calendar-wise, when we had you and your panel on initially, the war was about a month old, and there was, there's a lot we didn't know, but there were some things that we thought we saw or didn't see. But in those intervening months now, for yourself and Mr. Wilde, what are some things that you've seen, other pundits and analysts who have gotten wrong about how the course of the cyber conflict year has gone? And then maybe what are some things that you thought had unfolded that were not, in fact, things that panned out as the war went on?
As I've done this presentation and I've kind of started to travel again and talk to workshops about this issue, the thing that disappoints me the most is that basically pundits have gotten everything wrong. And it's not just cyber, it's mostly the entire course of this war. There have certainly been some stars like Rob Lee and Phillips O'Brien that have emerged on Twitter. But the bottom line is most people just didn't know what to expect with this war, and they should have based on how Russia has fought in Syria and fought in Ukraine in the past. What really disappoints me, though, is not that pundits get things wrong. That's natural. That happens. What disappoints me is that there are no consequences for failure. And there's this entire ideas industry, which I put under quotes, in the think tank community that isn't producing ideas, that isn't producing the discourse and pushing it forward. And I won't leave the academics out of this because while the academics, some of them, like me, myself, and my team, Erica Longren, as I mentioned before, Jackie Snyder, the Israeli team out of Haifa with Michael Gross and Daphne Kennedy, and Eric Gartsky and Nadia Kostyuk, a lot of them have been on track for this war, but getting the policy part of it right is really difficult. And this is really kind of where we're banging our heads against the wall, is that while there is significant Russian capability to leverage cyber war, that doesn't mean they can leverage it on the target on the day when these questions come up. And getting the sort of policy right has really been lacking. And then, finally, the question will be, what do we learn from this war? What does Asia learn from this war? What do the Taiwanese learn from this war? What do the Americans learn from this war? I'm kind of troubled by the emerging Biden cyber strategy that will basically kind of continue with this idea that cyber is not escalatory. And that's, of course, an empirical finding. That's, of course, something that my work has supported. But that doesn't mean you should enable a policy of more escalatory cyber actions because you don't think the Russians will react. That's always been our fear, right? That you push the Russians into a corner, what will they do? And we're still pushing the Russians into the corner. And certainly that's warranted to recover territory in Ukraine. But just how far we're willing to go is a question. And how far we think we can go without provoking a reaction is really a dangerous question. And I think we're skirting too far on the willingness to kind of test the limits. And I don't like testing the limits in cyber because while I don't think there's going to be a cyber Pearl Harbor, that doesn't mean I don't think there could be. So I'll toss it back with that.
Great, thank you. Mr. Wilde, anything to add to those comments?
Yeah, I think I would just add in the context of last year, I think that the question that all of this has raised for me is where, much like Dr. Valeriano says, I completely accept the preponderance of cyber disruption that we've seen. Where I find the assumption breaks down among kind of commentators is that that's necessarily synonymous with some degree of kinetic destruction. And I think that's where, again, both from a threat perception, our own threat perception, as well as how we operationalize cyber, not only cyber, but information operations as well. It's kind of a unique domain. It's paradoxical in my mind. And I'm not a military expert, but I get the sense that it's unique in that the BDA is the hard part, where in other domains, the intentionality, the planning, the tradecraft, and the execution are the mysterious part. The BDA is the obvious part. In the kinetic world, it seems to me. In the information domain, it seems like that's kind of reversed, where we almost assume that because we can see the intentionality in such full and often cartoonish display, but the mysteriousness is in assessing what did it actually achieve? Where does it have a contingent effect versus an emergent effect? Or where does it equate to, over some bounded temporal period, some degree of impact? And as Brandon says, I think there needs to be a lot more research and a lot more thinking about how to measure that before we continue to kind of operate on a very linear assumption that an amalgamation of cyber disruption or an amalgamation of information operations, propaganda campaigns, etc., necessarily equate to X. Because I think, in a lot of ways, one of the most surprising things to me is how unwilling we are to kind of take the W and lend the Ukrainians the credit that they're due. Because if you ask me, the Kremlin's quote unquote persistent engagement in the information space since as far back as 2014 has been a strategic and kind of catastrophic loss for them. It's brought about the very dynamic that they were seeking to avoid. And so this, I think there's a paper out that I've been reading about the failure of bombardment that, in World War II and in other conflicts, where this idea that if we just bombard enough, that the popular and the leadership will break down and erode, and we will finally emerge victorious. I think there's a tendency towards that idea in cyber and information space that, if in the context of this conflict at least, certainly has not borne out. And so that's kind of led me to question, again, the degree to which this cyber and information bombardment as a concept can really be relied upon as a strategy, both from the Russian perspective and our own.
Great, thank you. So next question, kind of jumping off what you just mentioned about, the effectiveness or lack thereof of the cyber bombardment, as well as, giving Ukrainians credit where credit is due. First question here in the chat is from Anna Sharbina. and it sort of touches on that. So I'll sort of paraphrase here, but you can both see it in the chat. But it goes back to Dr. Valeriano's slide showing how the average severity of cyber incidents had actually, the severity had decreased even though the number of incidents went higher. So I guess maybe that was that sort of cyber barrage. And then asking whether, rather than looking at average severity, whether looking at incidents of maximum severity is something that should be taken into consideration, given that the more barrage, I guess, you make, maybe the averages are not great, but you're still increasing your chances of a more catastrophic event just by sheer volume. And our final point is that maybe we hadn't seen the damaging events yet because of those Ukrainian cyber defenses that have been, probably built up and gotten some experience over time due to that persistent engagement by the Russians, because Ukrainian had lots of opportunities to learn from what the Russians were doing to them. So back to you, either of you gentlemen, for your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I think this is what I want to encourage, this sort of question, the why question. And the data can't answer the why question. The data can only set the kind of course of what we accept as a reality. And I think there's a problem in the community where a lot of people can't necessarily accept that this reality is what has happened. And I even had someone say the other day, well, the Canadians said there's massive cyber war. And, it's just, it goes on and on. Just about every prominent US, Ukrainian, NATO policymaker has said that they expected more from Russia and it didn't materialize in Ukraine. And that leads to the question of why. Data can't really answer that question. We need new and different methods. We need work like Gavin's work to kind of answer that question. There's a bunch of various hypotheses. It could be that Ukraine is very good at the defense. It could be that partners and alliances have enabled the defense, particularly the United States in its defend forward policy. It could be that Russia just sucks at cyber and we've got that wrong and continuously over time. It could be that the framework of offense, defense, and whether offense or defensive ascendance has been entirely wrong, and that the defense has been ascendant this entire time. And that's kind of what people are starting to accept. The other thing is that academically, we've suggested that there is no coercive capability through cyber so far, and that we shouldn't have even expected this in the first place. How you answer that question really tells you a lot about what you think about this war, what you think about the course of technology, and how technology will impact wars. I think that's the most interesting thing. But instead, we devolve to more regressive questions, and we kind of overall focus on debating the reality. And to me, that's not useful. I want to move towards these questions. And maybe I'll have something to say about these questions in about a year or so. But right now, I'm just focused on debating the reality, because I feel like we're knocking our heads against the table, kind of going over and over again about what it is and what isn't that's going on in the Russia-Ukrainian war. Gavin?
I think the quote that you posted from Jay Healy, in a lot of ways, I do think, I don't want to call it an opportunity, because clearly, obviously this conflict presents us with, as he says, an unprecedented window into what we can expect from cyber and information in a large-scale conventional military conflict. And as Dr. Valeriano says, I think it would behoove us to take that for what it's worth and allow it to check our priors about how, whether there is truly a ceiling beyond which offensive cyber capability in a kinetic conflict cannot reach in terms of efficacy, cannot reach in terms of timeliness, cannot reach in terms of control. And I grant that Russia is as everyone notes, Russia is a very capable adversary in cyberspace. So I think that's what I would foot stomp, is that let's not let this conflict, as historically significant as it is, lead us to just simply accepting our previous notions about cyber, and let it really give us an opportunity for gut check, not only to kind of level set how much of a defensive crouch we've let ourselves get into with regard to Russia, but how much we depend on some of this thinking in our own strategy making and planning for conflict. Because I think the natural question that I think is percolating throughout DC is how much of this experience can be ported into other contexts, particularly with regard to China and Taiwan. I don't know the answer to that, but it would be, I think, a massive waste to not to simply operate on old assumptions, given this really historical context that we find ourselves in.
Great, thank you both. So Ms. Sherbina threw another question in there, and I think in some of you sort of touched on in terms of Russian has demonstrated cyber capabilities in the past, but going to more into why, I guess the why, right, that we've talked about here is it does not, based on sort of the strength of past performance, why the impacts and I guess sort of that severity in specifically 2022 kind of went down, even though the volume was still there. And an interesting note there is that she's asking whether there's some sort of perhaps like human factor inside Russian cyber ranks in that that might contribute to a lack of effort or sort of discontent. Or I'll add this onto the question, then turn it over back to you. But in our separate series here through the Krulak Center, looking specifically at the war in Ukraine with Dr. Yuval Weber, we've noted continually that the sort of the culture of corruption and hiding information that Putin has built and put down on top of all aspects of society, seems to definitely impact the performance of the Russian military on the battlefield because, your tanks don't work as well when you sell the gas on the black market to go buy booze. So maybe is there perhaps a corollary to that there's some part of that culture of corruption or hiding information might have influenced the capability of the the Russian cyber attacks and cyber operations in an unexpected way, because we had previously seen them seem to have a relative degree of effectiveness before the war started.
I think it's certainly a valid hypothesis, and I think I would say both on the kinetic end and the cyber end that we've seen throughout this war that your organization matters, morale matters, your order of battle matters, all of those human factors that you can't simply modernize your way out of. Those things matter, and I think they certainly inhibited Russia's surge capacity for cyber operations in this war. I think that's absolutely a valid assessment. And I think it's fair to point out too that now with the exodus of a lot of Western software and hardware and tech, and updates for which are not going to be forthcoming, and the reported exodus of a lot of tech and cyber talent out of the Russian workforce, I think it's fair to assume that the Russian kind of cyber umbrella writ large is going to get a lot smaller over time, because they're going to run a lot of technological debt. They're going to run a lot of human capacity debt that's going to be difficult to reconstitute over time. And so I think, as we look at Russia over the horizon as a cyber threat, I think it's fair to ask those questions as far as like, have we seen their best days now behind them? I think that's an absolutely fair question to ask.
There's a large literature in political science about military effectiveness and types of government. And a lot of it might be a little bit overwrought. A lot of it might be over predictive in some ways. But I think there's something that's very relevant there for us to kind of examine. And that this is something that we need to accept about authoritarian militaries, is that there can be a price for success. And, I wish someone would develop this story in this way and, someone would do some reporting on this. But I think the colonial story and the Revel story is very indicative here, where the ransomware operators got very far and did a lot of damage and were very successful. And what happened? The United States and the international community got mad. They caused a problem for Putin, and Putin rolled up all those people and arrested them. And as far as I know, those people are still in jail. And that's a lesson about the price of success in an authoritarian military, that you can go too far. That initiative is not exactly encouraged in an authoritarian military, and operating on your own can really bring a devastating blowback and put you in jail. So, I think there is some impetus on the Russian side and their cyber operator side to kind of maybe do the least. I don't know. But this is where this intense research on the bureaucratic and organizational processes within the cyber militaries is important. We've gone too far in doing things about trying to measure capabilities or measure cyber strategies or measure cyber commands and things like that. You really need to look at how these militaries fight and how they organize. And there's a lot to be said here about the difference between an authoritarian and a democratic military and how it might fight.
Great, thank you. And yeah, that's sort of been a theme that's been winding its way through our rabbit hole series on Ukraine, and we sort of hadn't really talked about it in the cyber context. But now I'm curious because the sort of our working thesis is that the trickle down effect of like the regime Putin has built has influenced everything under him, and certainly seems to extend to conventional battlefield performance. But we really hadn't thought about what are the impacts on his cyber warriors. To your point of you do too well, that could be a threat to the regime. We can't have that. So it's better to have less efficient performance, but stuff that you can control. So another question for you, and then I'll sort of take a look at the clock in the chat and see if we have any more, and then look at wrapping it up here at the top of the hour. But I'm curious, you mentioned how there didn't seem to be a significant shift in how Russia conducted its cyber operations from, before the war to conduct of the war, as well as, a change in performance. In fact, as the overall performance seemed to sort of go down a little bit. Your general thoughts on, do you think the U.S. would do any better, or would we see a shift in operational focus if we were now engaged in a conventional conflict? And sort of my assumption would have been, before this discussion, you probably would have seen our attempts go up, like our overall performance go up, because we're going to be trying a lot harder now, right? But it's very striking to me that Russia didn't seem to sort of shift how it was conducting. Do you think we would do that, or Dr. Valeriano, starting with you, talking about the cyber policy, does that indicate that maybe we would not necessarily shift peacetime into wartime, how we conduct our own business?
I would think, and I would hope we would do better. I think there's a lot of evidence that the U.S. is a lot better at generating concessions from cyber than anyone else, that our capabilities are quite good. The only thing I worry about, though, is joint operations. And of course, that is a focus, and that is an issue the U.S. military has dealt with for a long time. But the question is, when push comes to shove and a war really happens, are we really going to be able to leverage joint operations in these spaces? Are we really going to be able to leverage multi-domain operations? I think we are better than everyone else, but being better than everyone else doesn't mean you get this perfect. And it's going to be a lot of growing pains as we start to do this. I mean, the challenge is that every planner knows about how to leverage cyber operations in a military campaign. The challenge, though, is, can you do that for that very specific campaign that you've been tasked to leverage effects on, absent of a case study? Can you really do this in reality? And when push comes to shove, doing this in reality and finding the right targets and finding the right packages in 0 days to leverage on those targets may be highly contingent to the defender, to your capabilities, to the international legal situation, to the international institutional situation. All those things are going to matter, and there may be growing pains for the U.S. But yes, I think we will do better. But the question is really, how much better can you do when cyber effects can be very limited overall?
I would just add to that. I would agree entirely, and I think the reason the U.S. would do better is because we've started to accept this idea that cyber and information operations are an adjunct at best. Admiral Rogers had a great podcast with Jackie Schneider several months ago, where he said part of those conversations that he routinely had with not only senior U.S. officials but his counterparts with stars on their shoulders was, guys, this is not a capability that acts on its own, that has impacts that are freestanding. This is something that I can be additive, but I think our understanding of those limitations are huge. The issue I think that we still haven't fleshed out is however better postured we might be organizationally and in terms of jointness than perhaps the Russians are. I think the debates about intel gain loss, the legal issues, the diplomatic environment, Those debates are vociferous right now in a period of, conventional or relative peace, I would say, in the U.S. context. In wartime, I don't think those are going to get easier to navigate, and so that's something I hope planners and strategists are thinking about in terms of level setting their expectations about what can be achieved through cyber effects. And Dr. Valeriano noted the limitations of technology. One of my favorite quotes from Martin van Creveld is that, like, though historical hindsight often reveals the objective pressures towards the adoption of this or that solution, there's no question that the interaction of technology and war at any given time has been as much the product of the arbitrary and the accidental as it was of the inevitable and the necessary. And I think however that applies to X, Y, or Z weapon systems, it goes doubly for cyber operations, because they're often a product of what you have available at the moment. There's not a lot of ability to just kind of go shopping around the globe and pick out, exploits and targets. Those take time, they are complex, and it's an ever-changing environment. And so accepting that complexity and that chaos, rather than thinking about it in linear terms, I think is the biggest challenge in thinking about cyber operations from a blue team perspective.
Right. Thank you both very much. So we're approaching the top of the hour here. I don't have any more questions in the chat here or on my list. So I guess last few seconds here to both of you to share your final thoughts, and maybe if you could both share something that you'll be watching closely here in the course of the conflict over the next few months.
I'm really curious if the discourse evolves and changes. Do they start to accept the reality? And, and I'm part of the problem, but I really wish we stop asking the question of, is this cyber war? It's not an interesting question. We get it wrong continuously. Every time something happens, everyone starts to write about, are we going to invoke Article 5 of NATO? No. Article 5 specifically says it needs to be an armed attack. And what exactly is an armed, devastating attack leveraging cyber? That's a real difficult ask for this capability. And we really need to moderate our desires and intentions here. And this has been a useful case, and there's a lot we can learn from this case, but I think there are more interesting cases of information operations and cyber repression that'll be more impactful for the history of cyber conflict moving into the future.
Yeah, for me, I think one of the things I'd like to keep my thumb on, and I think Ms. Sherbina wrote it in the chat, is the impact of sanctions and kind of tech isolation on Russia's overall kind of cyber posture, from its ability to conduct espionage all the way to its ability to kind of conduct these attacks. So from person power to technological capacity, I think their isolation, judging from all the other sectors of their economy, I'm curious to see how that impacts their cyber prowess going forward.
Great. Thank you both very much. All right. And with that, we will wrap up this inaugural episode of the 2023 season of the Brewcast. To Dr. Brandon Valeriano and Mr. Gavin Wilde, appreciate you both helping us put this together and launch us into the new year, although January is almost over. To our audience, as always, thank you for your participation, and make sure you are, if you want to see more of this, I've got the 2023 schedule sort of mostly in play. So following this, there's going to be regular updates coming here out through January and into the rest of 2023. So if you want to stay on board of that stuff, make sure you're following us on social media or get on our email distribution list so you can look for future opportunities. All right. And again, gentlemen, both, thank you very much. And I hope the conflict is not going on in a year from now, but maybe some point in the more distant future, 6 months to a year, we'll at least have some more information where we can revisit the discussion and see, what happened, what didn't happen, and whether we have a better sense of cyber use on the battlefield. So again, both, thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.